There's a theory buried in dusty old naval records and whispered through crackling phone lines that in 1943 the government cracked the code of time itself. Not cloaking, not camouflage, true invisibility. And for a few terrifying moments, something even worse, time displacement. Some say it was Tesla tech, some say Einstein's. Others say it never happened at all. But what if it did? What if the government figured out how to bend time and then immediately buried it? Welcome everyone to a special Memorial Day edition of Paranormal Directive 13. I figured what better way to celebrate Memorial Day than a true government cover-up and conspiracy. Nothing screams USA like burying the truth in a bunker no one will ever find. Today, we're investigating one of the stories that blur the line between fact and fiction, diving into one of the most enduring naval mysteries of the 20th century, where not only did something disappear, but apparently traveled to a different time and then back again. We're talking about the Philadelphia experiment. It's October 28th, 1943. It's the height of World War II at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. There's a destroyer escort called the USS Eldridge docked there in the murky waters of the Delaware River. The air is thick with anticipation as naval officers and scientists gather on the dock, clipboards in hand, ready for what's about to happen. And what happens next is either one of the most significant scientific breakthroughs in human history, or it's one of the most enduring myths of all time. The experiment began just after 9 a.m. Scientists and military personnel surrounded the ship, monitoring banks of equipment hastily assembled on the deck, and the sailors aboard the Eldridge had only been given minimal information, only that they were participating in an experiment to make the ship invisible to enemy radar. Power flowed through the massive electromagnetic generators. Witnesses would later describe an eerie sensation that kind of spread throughout the area. The air became charged, almost thick with electrical potential. Sailors reportedly feeling a tingling sensation across their skin like static electricity, but just more intense. Within minutes, a greenish-blue glow circled and enveloped the entire ship. Men on the shore would later claim that they could see through the ship's hull, almost like it was becoming transparent before their eyes. And the sailors on board watched in horror as their own hands and bodies began to fade out of view. And then, in an instant, the Eldridge vanished completely. It just was there 1 second, gone the next. And the ship, along with the entire crew, it just disappeared from this Philadelphia harbor. But then, minutes after it disappears from Philadelphia, it appears hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. The waters of the Norfolk harbor were suddenly disturbed by a massive electrical disturbance. The air is crackling with energy, and this greenish fog materialized over the water. Navy personnel and dock workers watch as the Eldridge appears out of nowhere, just materializing in the harbor for just a couple minutes. They would later describe seeing the ship clearly enough to identify it was the Eldridge, with confused and disoriented sailors visible up on the deck, and some men appeared to be kind of stumbling about like they were in a daze, while others appeared to be screaming, but they couldn't really hear anything on the shore. And before anyone could respond or do anything, the ship vanished again, disappearing back into that strange green fog. And then moments later, back in Philadelphia, the Eldridge reappeared at its original spot. But this is where, the nightmare truly kind of takes place, because something had gone seriously wrong with this experiment. As the ship rematerialized in Philadelphia, the scene that greeted the emergency responders was just horrific beyond any imagination. The air was filled with the smell of burning metal and flesh, and the deck was just in chaos. A lot of the sailors seemed to be in deep states of shock, unable to really recognize their surroundings or respond or anything like that. Some just wandered around aimlessly, just staring off into nothingness, just confused of what was going on. And then the worst cases, some men were found partially fused into the steel bulkheads in the decks of the ship. Their bodies fused with metal as though the structure of both of them had somehow merged into one. Other crew members were flickering in and out of sight, like they were stuck halfway between this reality and another, like they were just flashing in and out of existence. And some crew members just vanished completely, never to be seen again. Medical personnel were just overwhelmed by the nature and the extent of the injuries. They didn't understand, what do you do when a man's arm has become part of a ship? They didn't know what care they could give to help someone who's only partially in our reality. The entire incident was classified at the highest level immediately. The ship was quarantined, witnesses sworn to secrecy, and all the records were sealed. The Philadelphia experiment became one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. But then that begs the question, did this actually happen? Or is this one of the most elaborate hoaxes in military history? What happened in the aftermath? The theories, the thoughts, the witnesses, and what they say, what actually happened here. And to do that, we first need to understand how this story really came into the mainstream consciousness of people and how they first heard about this. And that begins not with the experiment itself, because that was classified. It begins with a strange book that arrived at the Office of Naval Research back in 1956. So in the summer of 1956, a package arrived at the Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C. And inside was a copy of the book called The Case for the UFO, written by astronomer Morris K. Jessup. But this wasn't just a normal copy. The entire book, the margins were filled with these cryptic annotations in different color inks and symbols and just these weird markings on every single page of the book. And the notes appear to be written by 3 different individuals who identified themselves in this book only as A, B, and Jemmy, Jemi. In their handwritten comments, they reference extraterrestrial beings, advanced technologies, and most significantly to this story, a Navy experiment conducted in Philadelphia during World War II that had gone horribly wrong. And the Navy officials were really intrigued, or maybe even more concerned, to contact Jessup about the book. They showed him this copy of the book, and Jessup reportedly recognized the handwriting from correspondence he had with another man named Carl Allen, and this man sometimes used the alias Carlos Miguel Allende. In the Office of Naval Research, they were really intrigued by these annotations. They actually commissioned a small Texas defense contractor called Vero Manufacturing to produce a limited run of copies of this book, and became known as the Vero edition. There was only about a dozen made, and it really became the cornerstone of this topic and experiment in Philadelphia. So to understand what they were trying to do on the ship, we need to kind of talk about the scientific principles they were trying to work on. According to proponents of the story, it was built on this groundbreaking work from several scientists of that era. The foundation began with Einstein's unified field theory, which was an attempt to unify the fundamental forces of nature into a theoretical framework. And though Einstein never successfully completed this theory in his lifetime, the Philadelphia experiment story suggests that he actually had, and this was the first attempt to put that into use. The idea behind the experiment was to manipulate the electromagnetic fields around the ship to the point where they would bend light around the vessel and render it invisible to the naked eye. Not actually invisible, but just bend the light around so you can't physically see it. But the theoretical framework of this supposedly went much deeper. The Navy scientists had developed a system of massive electromagnetic generators, essentially giant degaussing coils, that could create a field so powerful it would affect the fundamental fabric of space-time around the Eldridge. Blends legitimate physics concepts with speculative kind of pseudoscience ideas. It supposedly used principles of electromagnetic radiation, field theory, and what some might call quantum entanglement to create this process. They were essentially attempting to create what modern physicists might call a localized space-time distortion. The idea was that if you could bend the space around an object sufficiently, light would flow around it rather than bouncing off of it, making it effectively invisible to both your eyes and radar. The setup involved wrapping the ship in massive copper coils and using high-power generators to create an intense electromagnetic field around the ship. And then this equipment was supposedly derived from the work of Nikola Tesla, as particularly his research into high-frequency electrical phenomena. And this is where the experiment takes a turn towards the science fiction side, which is the unexpected side effect of teleportation. Nothing in Einstein's published works or conventional physics or anything like that kind of suggests that making something invisible would also teleport it across space and time. So the theory is that by attempting to bend the light around the ship, they accidentally created a rift in space-time itself, and this massive electromagnetic field supposedly altered the fundamental properties of reality in that area around the Eldridge, temporarily shifting it into another dimension before it reemerged elsewhere. Of course, modern physics doesn't really show that this is a possible effect to happen of ripping through space-time and teleporting, no matter how powerful or strong this electromagnetic field was. Even with our advanced understanding of quantum mechanics and field theory and all that compared to where we were in 1940, the scientific principles that took place here are not something that really lends credence to being possible. It still just verges on that science fiction line of things. But now, if this actually occurred as it was described, it would represent not only a catastrophic failure, but also a devastating human tragedy. So how did the military allegedly respond to this disaster? The response was immediate and comprehensive. The highest levels of naval command and military intelligence were supposedly notified within hours of the Eldridge's reappearance, and the entire Navy shipyard was placed under a strict quarantine. Military police secured the entire perimeter while medical teams were brought in to deal with the actual sailors who were fused to the ship and blinking in and out of reality. And these weren't just ordinary medical teams. They included scientists familiar with what was going on and what could possibly happen. And apparently this medical team had the understanding that this could have possibly happened from what they were trying to do. The injured sailors faced a particularly cruel fate from all of this. The ones with the most severe injuries, the men who were partially fused with the ship's structure or having that temporal displacement flashing in and out of reality, were separated from the others and taken to secret facilities for study. What happened in those facilities is kind of left to the imagination. You can only wonder what experiments and things were happening to them in those places. Some survivors spent the rest of their lives in military psychiatric institutions, and their stories were just kind of dismissed as delusions, and their conditions were studied by government scientists trying to just kind of track them long term and see what happened to them moving forward. And the cover-up would have required the cooperation of hundreds or thousands of military personnel, medical staff, shipyard workers, government officials, everyone from the highest of the high-level admirals to the lowest-level civilians who were just happened to be nearby at the time, to maintain absolute silence and secrecy over one of the more extraordinary events that have ever occurred. The records of the experiment were immediately classified at the highest level. The Eldridge was quickly returned to service with a new crew who knew nothing of what happened, and the ship's logs were altered to show that it had been elsewhere during this time. The Navy employed classic tools of information control. You know the drill. Intimidation, misinformation, secrecy oaths. Witnesses were threatened with court-martial or worse. Deliberate disinformation was spread to discredit anyone who might come forward with anything about this. And some witnesses were even allegedly permanently silenced, if you get my drift. Though there's been no credible report that someone was killed over knowing too much about this information. So let's start with what we know for certain about the Eldridge. Naval records confirm that it was a destroyer escort with hull number DE-173, and it was constructed in 1943 at the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newark, New Jersey, not Philadelphia. The ship's deck logs and movement records, which are now declassified and available to researchers, tell a story that contradicts the legend. But, as we just heard, they altered the logs to remove this event from happening. So looking at these logs, if they were truly altered, no one would know. So the logs don't really give us a true sense of what happened. And then, of course, the Navy records show that the Eldridge was never equipped with massive electrical generators or specialized equipment. It was simply a destroyer escort, and its primary mission was anti-submarine warfare, not experimental physics. But again, just like the logs, if this were to actually happen, these records have been changed. There's no way they would keep a record that could eventually be available to the public that would show these things that happened. And now, the Navy did conduct classified research during World War II, including trying to make ships less detectable to enemy sensors, which they called a degaussing program, which is basically just removes the magnetic signature of the ship to radar, so it appears much smaller on the radar than it actually is. And now, this brings us to probably the most important person for the Philadelphia experiment, and that's Carlos Miguel Allende, also known as Carl Allen. And if there's a single individual most responsible for this, it is Carl Allen. His letters to Morris Jessup, the author of the Case for the UFO book in 1956, they represent the first detailed account of this alleged experiment. Now, Carl Allen was born in 1925. He was a former merchant marine who claimed to have witnessed the Philadelphia experiment while serving on the Andrew Forsyth, a Liberty ship allegedly anchored nearby. Now, he says, "I was on the deck of the Forsyth when it happened. We all saw it. The Eldridge, surrounded by a strange green fog, disappeared right before our eyes. Later, I heard from a sailor who had been on board. The things he told me would make your blood run cold." Now, Allen's background is difficult to verify. His marine records did show that he did serve aboard various vessels, but there's several inconsistencies with his story. For instance, the ship that he said he was stationed on, the Andrew Forsyth, was a real Liberty ship, but naval records don't place it anywhere near Philadelphia on that date. But again, those could have been altered, just like the Eldridge's logs, to try and, kind of throw people off the case, be like, hey, this was nowhere nearby. And investigators who tracked down and interviewed Allen in the 70s and 80s described him just as kind of erratic and inconsistent. His account of the experiment changed significantly over time, with details appearing and disappearing or being modified with kind of each retelling that he told. He was not a consistent source of what happened. And then in 1980, allegedly Allen confessed to Robert Gorman that the entire Philadelphia experiment story was a hoax and that there was a recording of this, but he later went on to recant that confession. And now, Allen's letters to Jessup were really kind of bizarre by any standard, written in multiple colors of ink with this strange grammatical construction using frequent capitalization for emphasis. They describe not only just the Philadelphia experiment, but also interactions with aliens, which he called the little men, and all sorts of other just kind of science fiction-y kind of elements to it. He wrote in the book, "The result was the complete invisibility of a ship, destroyer type, and all of its crew. While at sea, October 1943, the field was effective in an oblate spheroidal shape extending 100 yards, more or less due to lunar position and latitude, out from each beam of the ship." And then researchers who've kind of studied Allen's life think that he really kind of suffered from untreated mental health issues, and his writings and behaviors kind of align with certain delusional patterns and paranoid thinking and things along that line. Allen died in 1994, taking kind of whatever truth he knew to the grave. And then, just when we think the story can't get any stranger, we're introduced to Alfred Bielik. Now, he's a man who would change this from an already fantastic story into something even more. Now, he enters the story in the 1980s, adding more layers of complexity to make this even more controversial and strange than it already was. His story first came kind of public in the late 1980s at different UFO conferences, and he claimed to be an actual survivor of the experiment. And his version goes far beyond Carl Allen's story, because according to Bielik, he wasn't just a witness, he was actually on the Eldridge during the experiment. And Bielik said, "I was Edward Cameron then, before my memories were suppressed and my identity changed. My brother Duncan and I were both aboard the Eldridge when it happened. We jumped overboard as the ship began to disappear, and we ended up traveling through time. His story was much more elaborate and detailed. He claimed that him and his brother jumped from the Eldridge during the experiment, and they were somehow transported through time to the year 1983, 40 years in the future from when the experiment took place back in 1943. There he claimed he became involved in another project called the Montauk Project, which we'll get into in a future episode as well. The basics of the Montauk Project, according to Bielik, was just a continuation of the Philadelphia experiment research conducted at a base on Long Island, where they had experiments in time travel, mind control, interdimensional research, things that supposedly continued for decades after World War II. His claims represent a huge leap in the complexity and scope of the Philadelphia experiment, and he wasn't just adding details, he was creating this entire new mythology around secret projects spanning decades. And what made Bielik's story so compelling was his apparent sincerity and incredible detail. He would speak for hours about technical specifications, government officials, scientific procedures, all related to these projects that he had mentioned. He claims that his memories of these events had been suppressed through government mind control techniques, but they kind of began returning spontaneously in the 1980s, where he described kind of a process of gradual recollection over time. They kind of surfaced in fragments and bits and pieces until he was able to put them all together. And Bielik faced a lot of challenges with his credibility when people started investigating his background. Public records show that Bielik, he lived just a basic normal life, and there was no gaps in his life that would account for his time as he says, Edward Cameron. But again, just like the logs and everything of the Eldridge, these are all things that if the government's going through the process of suppressing memories through mind control, they would clearly also doctor a person's life records. I would imagine it's much harder to suppress a memory than it is to change a file on somebody. And there's really interesting videos of interviews from Bielik where they use a process called reverse speech, where they take what someone's saying and reverse it. And apparently it's supposed to give like hidden thoughts and messages into what you're saying. And I'm going to play a clip of one of these interviews right now so you can hear it. It's really creepy to hear, and it kind of gives you goosebumps just listening to it because it's just an odd sound. But it is interesting what comes out from doing this process on his interviews.
He had the choice of going ahead and hoping for the best, or, as he did choose, sabotage the test, detune the equipment so nothing happened and nobody was hurt. And, of course, he at that point...
That was the first test, Al, on the big ship?
That was the first test of a big ship.
And he detuned the equipment, actually took it off frequency so it wouldn't happen?
That's correct. He deliberately sabotaged the test.
So what you just heard was an interview with Al Bielik and Art Bell from Coast to Coast AM, where he was asking him about the Philadelphia experiment, and they ran his responses back through the reverse speech. And what you heard him saying, where they slowed it down, was him saying, sabotaged the vessel. And they replayed it 3 different times so you could get a little more clear. In the full video, there's a lot of other things that they have him say that you can hear backwards. A lot of it is pretty muffled and hard to tell without the subtitles. And then once they throw the subtitles on there, you can kind of piece it together and see where they got that from. But they're all about them being screwed over, problems with the ship, things going wrong. There's something about bodies in one of them. It's all just weird how he's not even saying these things, but when you play it backwards, they're able to pick these phrases out of the story about the Philadelphia experiment. And Bielik's involvement had a huge impact on how the Philadelphia experiment story kind of evolved. It changed from just this one thing into the beginning of a much bigger series of projects and events and different cover-ups and conspiracies and things of that nature. Just made it part of a larger ecosystem of conspiracies. Bielik continued to promote his version of everything that happened until his death in 2011. And his legacy, along with the Philadelphia experiment, is just complex. He added so many new dramatic elements that weren't part of the original story, but also expanded and made it a much more believable thing. Carl Allen's story of everything and the Allende letters and all that, They added one section of the story where Bielik is the one who expanded on that story and turned it into something bigger. Whether fact or fiction, this story has left a huge mark on American pop culture and conspiracy theories. What began as just obscure letters and a mini-run book just evolved into this huge cultural event that's been anywhere from Hollywood to video games to YouTube reaction videos. There's a book from 1979 called The Philadelphia Experiment Project Invisibility by Charles Berlitz and William Moore. And Berlitz was already a known author for his work on the Bermuda Triangle, which is another big mystery and conspiracy there. And then after this book, there was the movie, the Philadelphia Experiment film from 1984, which was a much more fictionalized, Hollywood type movie about it, but the basics of the story are all still part of it. And the Philadelphia Experiment kind of goes hand in hand along with Area 51, MK Ultra, other secret government programs, some of which we know are true and accurate and actually happened. And what makes it such a resilient theory is its blend of elements from secret military technology and Einstein's involvement, wartime setting of trying all these different things to get the upper hand, and the consequences from that. They just all mix together into this perfect cocktail of a story. There's a lot of parts of this that are verifiable. The Eldridge was a real ship. They were working on degaussing technology. Einstein and Tesla did have theories and things that could potentially cause problems with space and time. These are all things that are true and actually happen. The government is known to cover up experiments and things that they've tried and failed or tried and succeeded to keep the public knowledge at a minimum. And this story, it's always been one of my favorites ever since I was younger when I first heard it. It's just something that speaks to you that you could 100% see happening. Even as far-fetched as some of the scientific details seem, it's not out of the realm of possibility of something that you could envision happening. Now, some of the wilder details, those things are parts that you might be like, well, that's kind of embellished, that's kind of dramatized for the story, whatever. But the thought of the government trying to hide a ship at the height of World War II and all the other things that they were doing at the same time and then after, it's just really something that doesn't want to go away. It doesn't want to leave the spot of your mind that says, this is something that could have actually happened. Thank you guys so much for listening to this special edition episode of Paranormal Directive 13. I appreciate you being here, listening to the show. If you like the show, please go give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify or whatever app you use. And then, as always, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/paranormaldirective13, where for just $5 a month, you can become a Directive founder and get access to weekly mini episodes. There's 2 on there right now at the airing of this show. And I am looking at adding another show on Mondays that I'm hoping will be out, not this Monday at the airing of this episode, but probably next Monday we'll have something there as well. So there's a bunch of extra content you can get on the Patreon. And of course, follow us on the social medias. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, /Paranormal Directive 13, where we're putting daily updates of different cases, different cryptids, different things like that. Other things that are not quite long enough for a mini episode, but still want to put out there. So we put those up on the social media. And then, as always, send an email to paranormaldirective13@gmail.com with any thoughts, any stories you want to cover, anything like that. We always are looking for suggestions on things that you guys want to hear about, and that is the perfect way to be able to get in touch with me. And if you're out in Philadelphia this Memorial Day and you see a greenish fog around the harbor, keep your eyes open for a ship. You never know if it might show up.